Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Julian Siggers, the Williams Director of the Penn Museum, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first of the year's Great Beasts of Legend series that's running from the first Wednesday of each month, now through June. The series provides unparalleled access to the collection and to the specialized knowledge of our amazing scholars, and discounted admission is a particular benefit of being a member. Please check the website for subscription information and a series schedule as well. And come back to hear about Sphinxes, underwater panthers, Hobbits, and more. So I just saw the Hobbits bit. It's my particular pleasure tonight to welcome Dr. Steve Tinney, who will kick off this lecture series. Dr. Tinney is the Associate Curator in charge of the museum's Babylonian Section and the Clark Research Associate Professor in Assyriology in Penn's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. In addition, he is Director for the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Material, and on top of all of that, he's the Deputy Director of the museum and a much valued colleague who is instrumental in helping us transform the galleries of the museum, starting with the galleries of the Middle East. He holds a BA from the University of Cambridge and a PhD from the University of Michigan. His research focuses on the Sumerian language and the cultural and intellectual history of ancient Mesopotamia, particularly ancient education and scholarship. He will speak this evening about the Mesopotamian great beast Anzu, the lion-headed eagle who wanted to rule the universe. Please join me in welcoming Steve Tinney.
All right, thank you very much, Julian, and welcome to you all. Thanks for coming. For those of you who are coming back, welcome back. It's great to see you again. Some of you remember me as the person who delays the talks most weeks by giving lengthy introductions. So, today, Anzu. We are in Mesopotamia, primarily southern Mesopotamia. What you're looking at here is the Middle East, the ancient Middle East, and we are almost exclusively down in the south of this area. We're going to cover about 2 millennia, from about 2500 BCE to about 500 BCE. So we are going to move around Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, Isin, and we'll get a little bit up to Assyria up here in the north, Nineveh, and so on, in the second, or the very last really part of the talk. Here's a close-up of the south. The cities that we're interested in, Ur, Uruk, especially Lagash. Notice this dotted line. This is the shoreline of the Persian Gulf in the 3rd millennium BCE. So this changes things a little bit. It means that Uruk, Lagash, and Ur were very close neighbors and really have to be seen as peers in the system in the 3rd millennium. And you'll see how that comes out in a minute. So, I'm going to start with a little bit of background about Anzu in early Mesopotamia, by which I mean, let's say, 2500 to 2000 BCE. And the interesting thing about this period is that Anzu is seemingly everywhere. This is the earliest attestation of his name. I'm sure you can see that, right? I'll help you out. This is an administrative text from what we call early dynastic 3a, roughly 2500 BCE, from a city, the ancient name is Shuruppak. And it actually, Anzu's name actually occurs in a proper noun, a name, right here. This star is the god sign, Dingir. And right here it says Dingir Sud. Sud is one of the patron deities of the city. And underneath it, there's another star, Dingir, and then a mi sign. And then this sign at the end is Mushen. Mushen means bird in Sumerian. And the name of Anzu is always written with the bird sign following it. It's called a determinative. So this name is Sud Anzu. Most people would say Sud is Anzu. I'm not sure if that's true. Sud and Anzu, maybe. It's very enigmatic, but that's the first time, so as I know, he's mentioned. Anzu pops up in a lot of art contexts in this period. This is a lintel is quite large, not as large as it is on the screen. It's in the British Museum. It sat above this doorway in the Ninhursag temple in Ubaid. We actually have quite a lot of the material from Ubaid in the Penn Museum. We don't have the lintel, unfortunately. We have some of these bulls and friezes, and in the new Middle East galleries that Julian referenced, you'll be able to see some of this stuff set up in some way reminiscent of the way that it occurred in the ancient world. So Anzu is associated with the goddess Sud, with the goddess Ninhursag. This is a plaque from the same temple. This is one of our pieces. That's our number down there. And this is a common theme. Anzu is chomping on the back of some kind of wild bull with a beard and a human face. I honestly don't understand exactly what that is. There are people who say that it represents the god Shamash, the sun god. It's hard for me to imagine that Anzu is eating the sun god. So, when we get to texts, things are much better, trust me. And he occurs at Ur. He's not front and center at Ur. This is another famous piece in the British Museum from the royal tombs of Ur, which will also be laid out in spectacular fashion in the new galleries. This is the so-called peace side. I think many of you will be familiar with it. It shows people bringing produce for some kind of a banquet. This is the ruler, the king. Sumerian for king is big man, and he's bigger than everybody else, right? Then there's a war side. Nice chariots and phalanxes, and again, the king is up here receiving prisoners. No Anzus yet. The ends, I always complain that nobody looks at the ends of the Royal Standard of Ur. This is one end, has this nice mountain goat jumping over a mountain. It's set in the mountains. These three holes may even be the archaic cuneiform sign for mountain. Yeah? And on the other end, there we've got our Anzu. Down at the bottom here, we've got two of them, and here's a blow-up. The bull man here is looking a little bit startled, I think. I think I would be as well. And here's the plaque from Ubaid for comparison. And then finally, my sort of iconic piece today is another piece that's associated with the city of Ur. It's actually found at a place called Mari, up the Euphrates, in a little treasure trove. We don't know what the treasure trove was for. It's clearly sent from Ur to Mari. Maybe it's a dowry or something. But this is the best Anzu out there. Yeah? The wings are lapis lazuli, this blue stone. The body and the head and the tail are gold. And you can see in the eye sockets bitumen. The bitumen would have had shell or some kind of inlay. So this would have been a fantastic piece. It's in the Louvre, because the French excavated Mari. So when we first find Anzu, he's all over, he's associated with a bunch of people, a bunch of deities. But it's the city of Lagash where he's really, really super important in lots of ways. Firstly, he's a great art item. This is a plaque made by or dedicated by the chief temple administrator of Lagash, and is dedicated to the god Ningirsu. So when we talk about Lagash, we actually mean two cities, like Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Philadelphia, Camden. We say Lagash Girsu. There's two towns that are quite close together, and they act as a pair. And this is dedicated to the god Ningirsu, who's the chief god of Girsu. And this says Dudu, who's the name of the administrator, the Sangha Dingia Ningirsu Ka, the Sangha of the chief administrator of Ningirsu. And it tells us what this nice thing is for. You see the Anzu holding lions. We'll come back to that later. He says Dudu dedicated it to Ningirsu. And down here, he says he fashioned it to use for the nails in the roof beams, the gag ngeshur. So when they're making these big temples, they fix these plaques and they drive nails through them as part of the construction. And you can see that Dudu is here. Unfortunately, he's broken. And Anzu with his lions. Remember, Ninhursag, they had deer. And then this I don't understand. And this I'm very curious about. Is this just filler? You'll see in a moment that when they describe Ningirsu in the texts, they describe his lower parts as being like the flood. And I'm just curious, I'm just speculating whether all these wavy, vortex, spinning, eddying lines could be an allusion to that. Or maybe they're just filler. So then we get a little more pregnant, I think, because we have material that has larger, more politically motivated inscriptions. This is a piece we call the Stele of the Vultures. It's also in the Louvre. I'm going to show you close-ups of each piece, but you see this characteristic shape. There were lots of these things in third millennium Mesopotamia. We have bits of one that belong to Ur-Namma that we're going to put in the galleries. Gudea tells us he made 7. So what's on this? Well, the king, Eonatum, in his chariot. You can see how similar the chariot is to the chariots on the royal standard of Ur. Essentially the same culture, same artwork. A nice phalanx. You can see the inscription. I'll talk about the inscription in a moment. They're walking over the bodies of their enemies. Not a good day for them. It's called the Stele of the Vultures because of this part of the relief. You can see there are people. This is a head, and these are rib cages, and the vultures are tearing at the bodies on the battlefield. Here's a vulture who's carrying off a loose arm, yeah, hence the title. This is a sign, an emblem, a standard with Anzu on top of it. And this is probably the god Ningirsu. Not everybody would agree with that, but I think it has to be. And Ningirsu is holding a net full of the naked bodies of slain enemies, and holding the net is Anzu himself holding the lions. And this text is about the defeat that Lagash inflicts on its enemies, and about how they all have to swear oaths to respect Lagash in the future. That's what all of this is about. It's very highly ritualized. It's the earliest account of ritual practice we have, and it's probably from about 2400 BC. So fast forward a bit. We're still in Lagash, because really, Ningirsu and Anzu is a Lagash thing. Okay? This is my old friend Gudea. He was a king of Lagash around 2100 BCE. And he left us the most important piece of Sumerian literature in existence. Gudea's building account, where he builds the new temple for Ningirsu, the Eninu, the 50 house. And what's so interesting about this is that Anzu features in it. Ningirsu and Anzu feature in it. The account starts with a little praise to Lagash, and it continues with Gudea incubating a dream. He lies down in the temple and has a dream. And the dream is something he doesn't understand, because in ancient Mesopotamia, you never understand your own dreams. You always have to go to an interpretress, and that interpretress is often your mommy. Okay? So Gudea goes to his divine mother, Nanshe, the goddess of Lagash, and Nanshe explains the dream. She says, "My shepherd," that's Gudea, "I will explain your dream for you in every detail. The person who, as you said, was as enormous as the heavens, who was as enormous as the earth, whose head was like that of a god, whose wings, as you said, were like those of the Anzu bird, and whose lower body was like a flood storm, that was Ningirsu. He spoke to you about the building of his shrine, the Eninu." So the god Ningirsu has physical attributes like Anzu, and he appears to Gudea and says, "You must build my temple." Okay? And Gudea does. We have lots and lots of archaeological evidence of that. Unfortunately, we don't have the architecture. The site was dug in the 19th century, and the walls were either not discovered or not identified. But we have lots and lots of bricks and cones and so forth. And what's interesting about this temple is that when Gudea rebuilt it, he features Anzu in it, because he changes the name. It's not just the Eninu. It says up here, Dingi Ningirsu, Ursang Kalaga Enlila, the mighty hero of Enlil, his lord, for Ningirsu. Gudea, the NC of Lagash, the governor of Lagash, built, Munadu, the Anzu Babara. Here's Anzu, the dingir, the god sign. Immi, Mushen, the bird sign. The white Anzu. He built Ningirsu's house, which is called the White Anzu. And it's hard for us to imagine what those look like. here's a nice reconstruction of a temple that's not the Eninu, because we don't have it, but Gudea describes it for us. House, mooring post of the land. This is part of the theology. The cities are where the heavens are anchored to the land. The temples are the anchor points. Grown so high as to fill the space between heaven and earth, Eninu, the 50 house, the true brickwork for which Enlil, the god of Nippur, the supreme god, the king of the gods at the time, Ningirsu's father, determined a good fate. Remember fates. We're going to talk a lot about fates in the next 20 minutes or so. Green hill, standing to be marveled at, standing out above all the lands. The house is a great mountain reaching up to the skies. It is Utu, the sun god, filling the midst of the heavens. The 50 house Eninu is the white Anzu bird spreading its talons upon the mountain land. So there's a lot of references to Anzu at Lagash, which make him look like an agent of the gods, a feature of the gods, not something that's opposed to the gods, which is something we have to keep in our heads. Now, you only have to keep 3 texts in your heads today: Gudea cylinders, Lugar Bandha and Anzu, and the Akkadian Anzu myth, Anzu and Inuita. So it's not so bad. Lugar Bandha. Who the heck is Lugar Bandha? Some of you know, some of you have never heard of him. Most of you have heard of Gilgamesh. Lugar Bandha is Gilgamesh's father. And Lugar Bandha meets Anzu in the mountains. Lugar Bandha is an officer in the army of a legendary king called Enmerkar, who travels into Iran with his army, and Lugar Bandha falls sick. And he doesn't want to slow the army down, so he says, no, don't worry about me, lads. I'll be fine. Just leave me in this cave. I'll sort something out. And there's a whole text about this. There are 2 compositions about Lugar Bandha, one of which in which he gets left in the mountains, and the other of which he gets out, which is good for him, right? We're a little bit later now in time, gradually going down through the millennia, not even the centuries. This tablet is in our collection, and it's one of the Sumerian pieces of Lugar Bandha. And I put the copy here just to convince you that it actually does say something. And if you're looking close up, you can almost see some of this yourselves now. What's this? That's the Dingir sign, right? What's this? It's the bird sign, the Mushen. This is An Im Dugud this time. It's a different sign, same name, Anzu. Just so you know I'm not making it all up, right? It's important to have transparency of these things. So, a cave in Iran. We don't have any native depictions of this story. So at the start of this composition, Lugar Bandha and Anzu, Lugar Bandha is stuck on his own in the cave. He gets out and he finds Anzu's nest. Anzu's not there, only the chicks are there. But he has a thought. This is his plan. I shall treat the bird as befits him. I shall treat Anzu as befits him. I shall greet his wife with affection. I shall seat Anzu's wife and Anzu's child at a banquet. An, the sky god, the former king of the gods before Enlil, will fetch the beer goddess Ninkasi. Her fermenting vat is of blue lapis lazuli. Her beer cask is of refined silver and of gold. If she stands by the beer, there is joy. If she sits by the beer, there is gladness. May she make my beer serving perfect. And here's Lugar Bandha's great plan. When the bird has drunk the beer and is happy, when Anzu has drunk the beer and is happy, he can help me find the place to which the troops of Uruk are going. Anzu can put me back on the track of my brothers. So Lugar Bandha has a great plan. He's going to get Anzu drunk and then get his help. Right? How does that work out? Well, pretty well, actually. This illustration is from a kid's book about Lugar Bandha. Very charming description of Lugar Bandha with the Anzu family. He's a bit younger than I would imagine him. A little bit of artistic license. So what's happened in the interim is that Lugar Bandha has carried out this plan. He's also decorated the nest with lots of finery and made it shine, and he's hung salted meat in front of the chicks, and he's groomed the chicks. He's done everything he can so that when the Anzu flies back carrying cows in his talons, he sees his nest, and this is what happens. The bird is exultant. Anzu is exultant. He says, I am the prince who decides the destiny of rolling rivers. I keep on the straight and narrow path the righteous who follow Enlil's counsel. My father Enlil brought me here. He let me bar the entrance to the mountains as if with a great door. If I fix a fate, who shall alter it? If I but say the word, who shall change it? So what we're learning from this is that Anzu can define the fates, decree the fates. We didn't know this before this text. Whoever has done this to my nest, made it look like a temple essentially, if you are a god, I will speak with you. Indeed, I will befriend you. If you are a man, I will fix your fate. I shall not let you have any opponents in the mountains. You shall be hero fortified by Anzu. Sounds like a pretty good fate. Just a random piece of Anzu artwork. There's so much of it, I couldn't put it all in the slideshow. We'd have been here all night. So Lugar Bandha replies to the Anzu and says, well, fine, what fate do you propose for me? And Anzu proposes several fates in turn, and to each one, Lugar Bandha says, no, I don't want that. So Lugar Bandha actually refuses the Anzu's fates. And, Anzu's getting a little bit ticked off at him and says, now look, my Lugar Bandha, just think again, it's like this. A willful plough ox will be put back in the track, and a balking ass should be made to take the straight path. In other words, I could just set you to rights. I don't have to tolerate this, right? But I will grant you what you put to me. I shall assign you an allotted destiny according to your wishes. So holy Lugar Bandha answers him, let the power of running be in my thighs. He wants to be able to run fast, okay? Let me never grow tired. Let there be strength in my arms. Let me stretch my arms wide. Let my arms never become weak. And if you do that, I shall have the woodcarvers fashion statues of you, and you will be breathtaking to look upon. Your name will be made famous thereby in Sumer and will redound to the credit of the temples of the great gods. What Lugar Bandha's doing there, he's saying, if you do this for me, I'll make you a decoration on all the temples. And in fact, we know that Anzu figures as decoration on temples because, for one thing, we saw that one. And Anzu grants him this wish, and Lugar Bandha is then able to run after the army and catch up with his friends. And there's lots of hugging and general sort of bro fest, and they go on their way and they defeat the Iranians, the Aratans. So in this composition, there's nothing about Anzu which is illegitimate. Anzu's job, assigned by Enlil, is to sit in the mountains and decree fates. Anzu helps Lugar Bandha, and Lugar Bandha is subsequently the father of Gilgamesh, so Anzu is actually crucial in that whole series of tradition. So at Lagash, he seems to be an okay guy, and in this Lugar Bandha Gilgamesh cycle, he seems to be an okay guy as well. What happens next? So Anzu and Ninurta. Ninurta is another name for Ningirsu, essentially. There's a phenomenon in ancient Mesopotamia where the cities have their chief gods and their spouses and their families, and several of the cities have groups of gods that share parallel functions. So Ningirsu is the warrior god, the son of Enlil at Lagash. Ninurta is the warrior god, the son of Enlil in Nippur, which is Enlil's home. And Enlil, in the 3rd millennium, the early 2nd millennium, is the supreme god. He's the king of the gods. He owns the kingship of the gods. And you'll see that's going to come out in a moment. Now, the text that we were just looking at, Lugar Bandha and Anzu, dies out, just about, around 1730 BCE or so. There's another phenomenon in Sumerian literature, which is that it almost all dies out at this time. It's most prevalent in Nippur, and after the end of the 18th century BCE, only a few compositions survive. What happens is that the tradition changes, and we start to have myths written in another language, the other language, main language for cuneiform, which is called Akkadian. Okay? Akkadian is a Semitic language like Arabic and Hebrew. We understand it much better. But there are far fewer tablets. And I just wanted to think for a few moments before we talk about the Akkadian Anzu myth about the state of preservation of this composition. It's amazing that we know it as well as we do. There are 16 tablets and fragments. There may be more tomorrow, but today there are 16. And they range from about 1700 BCE to about 500 BCE, so about 1,200 years. So it's less than 2 tablets per century on average. And many of these things are fragments. Now, they actually cluster. Don't be misled into thinking there's actually 1.5 tablets per century. We have a couple from around 1650, we have a couple from around 750, 650, a couple from around 550. So they cluster over time. They mostly can give the same version to the extent we can reconstruct it. We have a couple of tablets that give apparently bizarre or alternate versions, but we can reconstruct a pretty nice, what we call a standard Babylonian version, which is what I'm going to talk about now. And that was divided into 3 tablets, where tablet is like a book in a book, like a part of a book, right? So they're not physical tablets necessarily, although they may be. And it totals only about 570 to 600 lines. It's not a very long text. We're not talking about the Iliad here, right? And if you're curious, you can go and read the whole thing on ORAC, which is the corpus building website that I run, and you can see the URL up there. Now, we do happen to have an amazing first millennium Assyrian depiction of the battle between Ninurta and Anzu. And this is the actual relief that's in the British Museum, and this is a drawing of it. And you can see Ninurta on the right and Anzu on the left, right in the middle of combat. So let's take some time and look at this story of Anzu. So it starts off with some praise of Enlil and Nippur, and there's a little broken passage, and in that passage somehow Anzu appears, and Enlil hears word that Anzu is out there in the mountains. This is a common setup in a class of myths that we call combat myths, which usually start with some kind of good stuff, and then there's a threat. And in this case, the threat is Anzu. But Enlil thinks about this threat and co-opts him. And he says, well, why don't we bring the Anzu into my temple? He can guard my temple, and he can hold the fates that I decree. Anzu's status is not to decree fates directly, but he does get to execute them, I suppose, or remember them for Enlil. And all is fine for the first 30, 40 lines of the text. Anzu is doing his job, and then he starts to get greedy. He starts to look at Enlil and look at the Tablet of Destinies, which I'll talk about in a second, and he covets the power, and he starts to hatch a plan to steal the Tablet of Destinies. So what is this Tablet of Destinies? The Tablet of Destinies is the thing that allows you to control the universe. We know from one isolated Assyrian text that they actually made some copies of the Tablet of Destinies, and it had designs on it. There are broken descriptions of the designs. We don't have the actual tablet, unfortunately. If we did, presumably we could rule the universe, right? This Tablet of Destinies is associated with being king of the gods, holding the ultimate power over the gods. Okay? And it features very prominently in a myth that's derived from Ninurta and Anzu, which I'm not going to talk about extensively today, but which gives us a very good insight into it, and where we learn, this is a myth about Marduk creating Babylon, where we learn that really the passage of power of the kingship of the gods is associated with the passage of the Tablet of Destinies. If you have the Tablet of Destinies, you're in. So Anzu watches Enlil and forms his evil little plan. And one day when Enlil is bathing and he's naked, so he doesn't have his power, he doesn't have his tiara, he doesn't have his powerful clothes, Anzu grabs the Tablet of Destinies and flies off to the mountains. Silence falls over the gods. It's never a good thing in Mesopotamian literature when silence falls. Noise, activity is good. Silence is death. The gods don't know what to do. Eventually, they get their act together a little bit and say, you know what? Anzu is sitting out there in the mountains. He's got the Tablet of Destinies. He's decreeing fates. He's a real threat. We have to send somebody out to deal with him. Let's ask some brave gods. And they ask a series of gods. I will say, between you and me, and I always feel nervous about saying this sort of thing, that they're fairly minor and unimportant gods. The reason I feel nervous about it is because one day I confidently expect to be struck down on stage while I'm saying these things. But they ask Gugalu, the son of Ishkur. And Gugalu says, no way. Anzu is out there. He's got all the power. He's got the Tablet of Destinies. That mountain is an unapproachable mountain. I'm not going to go near the unapproachable mountain. So they ask Gibel, the son of Ananitu. And Gibel says the same thing. I am not going out there. And they ask Shara, the son of Ishtar. And Ishtar says the same thing. You cannot expect me to approach that unapproachable mountain and deal with that character who's got the Tablet of Destinies. I'm not doing it. No. So they've all got their flat denials. The gods are not happy about this. They don't know what to do for a minute. But they go to the god with the plan. And those of you who know anything about Mesopotamian mythology know that there's one god who is called Ea in Sumerian Enki. He's the god of wisdom and magic. And he's always the god with the plan. And Ea says, I'll tell you what we're going to do. First, we're going to take the birth goddess, the creation goddess, Mami, and make her queen of the gods, Belet Ili. And then we're going to have her tell her son, Ninurta, that he'd better go out there and deal with that monster. So they elevate Mami to become Belet Ili, and Belet Ili talks to Ninurta thusly. Conquer flying Anzu, says mother to her son. Devastate the earth where he was created. Wreck his dwelling. Let the battle array resound against him. Let your ferocious battle force rage on against him. Let the entirety of it make the dust storm block him. Draw the bow. Let the arrow become poison to him. Let your features become changed like a Galu demon. Send out fog so he can't see your face. Let your radiance go against him. Let your attack be glorious. May you have radiance. Don't let the sun shine on him. Let the bright day turn to darkness for him. Destroy his life and conquer Anzu. Let the wind carry his feathers as good news to Enlil. Devastate and disrupt his mountain domain. Cut down the life of wicked Enlil. Let kingship re-enter Enlil's temple, the Acor. Well, Ninurta turns out to be a good son and doesn't refuse like everybody else has, but he flies into a battle rage. He goes to his cave or his house or whatever he has them in. He gets the 7 winds and his weapons, his bow and his arrow, and he marches out against Anzu, fearless, but not, as it turns out, completely successfully. He challenges Anzu and says, basically, I'm Ninurta, I'm here to kill you. And the text continues, Anzu heard his utterance and let loose his furious clamor from the midst of the mountain. Darkness fell, and the mountain was covered as the sun, the light of the gods, grew dark. He roared the attack. The sign of Anzu was his clamor. A cloud of death rained down. Arrows flashed like lightning. The mighty one, Ninurta, the resplendent one, the one of Mami, the support of Anu and Dagan, the loved one of Nishiku, drew the bow and knocked an arrow. From the handhold of the bow, he launched an arrow. Anzu called out to it, arrow that has come, return to your reed bed. Frame of the bow, return to your forest. Bowstring to the ram's tendon, arrow flight to the bird. And because he was carrying the tablet of destinies of the gods in his hand, the bowstring and the bow launched an arrow, but it did not approach Anzu's body, because Anzu can rewrite the fate of the arrow. So he's absolutely unapproachable, as all the other gods said before. The battle became deathly still, and the battle was held back. The clash of weapons ceased in the midst of the mountain. Anzu was not conquered. So, more silence, more problems. Fortunately, Ninurta is not out of options. So it turns out he has a magical talking mace. We all need one. Called Shaur. Shaur means in Sumerian, leveler of myriads. And he says to Sharor, go to Ea, report everything you've seen, and then come back and tell me what Ea says I should do. Convenient, huh? So Sharor goes off and repeats verbatim in the text what has just happened. One of the phenomena in these mythological texts is you get these long repeated passages. So the battle has happened, Sharor reports it to Ea, and Ea thinks for a minute, and he says, okay, I know what to do. And he gives Sharor the instructions, and Sharor comes back, and Sharor then speaks, the mace speaks to Ninurta, and this is what he says, what Ea says via Sharor. Do not rest in battle, that's how you will win. Tire him out so that he lets his wingtips droop in the oncoming force of the storm wind. O Lord, take hold of your arrows by their ends, cut off his wingtips, strike them off left and right. Let him look at his wings so that his magic words fail him. Then he will call out, my wings, to his wings, but you must fear him still. Draw from the handhold of your bow, let the arrow go like lightning, let wingtip and wing play like butterflies. Destroy his life and conquer Anzu. Let the wind carry his feathers as good news to Enlil, devastate and disrupt his mountain domain, cut down the life of wicked Anzu, let kingship re-enter Enlil's temple, the Acor. Some of this is familiar to you, right? It's the same motivational speaking as Mami gave her boy, and it has the same result. Ninurta flies back into his battle rage, grabs all his weapons again, and they resume battle. The description is quite short. It's slightly broken. There's a few lines broken, but it's quite short. But it's brutal. They're slinging blows at each other. They're wrestling. They're drenched in sweat. They rapidly become exhausted, which is just what Ea wanted to happen. Anzu rested in the oncoming force of the storm wind and let his wingtips droop. The Lord took hold of his arrows by their ends. He cut off Anzu's wings, striking them off left and right. Anzu looked at his wings, and it took away his magic words. Then when he called, my wings, to the wings, the arrow flew against him. The arrow went right across his heart. He made the arrow pass through wingtip and wing. The arrow passed through heart and lung. He killed the mountains. He disrupted and devastated the mountain domain. Ninurta killed the mountains. He disrupted and devastated his mountain domain. He devastated the wide earth in his fury. He devastated the midst of the mountains. He killed evil Anzu. The hero Ninurta took the tablet of the destinies of the gods into his hands, and the wind carried the feathers of Anzu as a sign of his good news. So Ea played a trick on Anzu, because Anzu's feathers are the same material, feathers, as the flights of the arrows. And when Anzu called his wings to him, he also called the arrow to him. So Ea was clever enough to use Anzu's ability to rewrite the destinies against him. So the text winds up with Ninurta returning triumphantly to Enlil and being praised and being given a series of names, new names. And among those names, they say, in the furrow, Ninurta, your name will be Ningirsu. In the city of Nisur, Ninurta, your name will be Lugar Bandha. So they appropriate all of those other traditions into this myth at the end. So they rewrite not only Anzu's story, but also the history of the mythology as well. So what is going on here? How does a perfectly ordinary 3rd millennium BCE monster become an evil demon? Well, I'm sorry to say, it's probably politics. We're all fed up of politics at the moment, aren't we? The best chance we have of understanding this comes through another very, very important document, which comes down to us in copies from, let's say, 1750 BCE, give or take a few decades, and it's called the Sumerian King List. And the Sumerian King List is a long text. You can see how big this thing is. Lists all the kings of each of the dynasties that were considered to have been sovereign over Sumer. Now, this is not a matter of historical reality, you understand, it's a matter of perspective. Okay? So the notion is that at any given point, one city is supreme over Sumer. And here are all the cities in the section of the king list that occurs after the flood that it says ruled Sumer, in the order that it gives them in the text. Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, Kish again, Hamazi, Uruk, Ur, Adab, Mari, Kish, Akshak, Kish, Uruk, Agade, Uruk, Ur, Isin. By Isin, we're down around 1850, 1900 BCE. Which famous city that we've been talking about today is never listed as sovereign over Sumer? Huh? I know you're thinking it, you just don't want to shout it out. It's Lagash. Lagash is never mentioned there, despite the fact that we know from their monuments and from the scale of Gudea's building operations that they had a culture just as significant as other Mesopotamian cities. So what happened? Another question. Who writes history? The winners, exactly. Lagash is very powerful and important, 2300 BCE, 2100 BCE. Gudea really represents, in a way, the pinnacle of Lagash's importance, because right at the same time as Gudea, Ur is resurging. And there's a king called Urnama who probably basically puts Lagash out of business. Lagash becomes a province in the Ur III state and never regains its former importance. By the end of the third millennium, the beginning of the second millennium, Lagash is a backwater. And all of that important stuff about Ningirsu and Gudea and the Anatum and the Seal of the Vultures, all of that is not just forgotten, it's suppressed, because it's not mentioned in the king list. So it seems reasonably plausible to think that maybe around the time that they're suppressing Lagash's importance, they also twist Anzu's story a bit. Anzu, so far as we know in the third millennium, isn't doing anything wrong when he sits in the mountains and decrees fates, and they'll put him there to do it. But in the story, the Akkadian story of Anzu and Ninurta, Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies. He's got no right to it. So that's a big contrast, and I think it's an interesting one for the history of the sort of myths and politics. We could carry the story on through other texts. The story I mentioned earlier about Marduk is known usually as the Babylonian Epic of Creation. It's not a very good title for it, because it's really the story about how Marduk becomes king of the gods. And when Marduk becomes king of the gods, he slays another monster, Tiamat, the sea. So then Anzu gets sucked into this thing that there are bad monsters out there. But I hope I've made the case that in the third millennium BCE, he doesn't really deserve it. So my closing thought for you is this. Should we believe the revisionism of the Akkadian story? Or maybe we should, as I like to think, because I'm very fond of the third millennium, consider Anzu not to be a bad monster, but a monster that sometimes does bad things. Thank you. So I'm happy to take some questions. As usual, if you'd like to ask a question, there are some microphones in the aisles. If you come to the microphone, then we can all hear them. Yes, please.
Do any of these myths exist today in their culture?
I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in contemporary Middle Eastern folk tales, for example. But I can tell you that in terms of the history of the combat myths generally, the whole thing about Ninurta and Anzu fades into Marduk and Tiamat, the sea, and that actually survives until late antiquity. There's a Greek paraphrase of it by a guy called Damascius from, I think, the 4th century CE. But after that, it pretty much dies out as far as I'm aware. Yeah, please.
Well, I was very taken by your mentioning of the Tablet of Destinies. I think I need one of those.
Well, we all do. But it doesn't work if there's more than one.
But I was just wondering about, inasmuch as I guess writing was had been invented not too long before, maybe?
So writing was invented, we would say, somewhere around 3200, 3000 BCE, something like that.
Is this sort of a reflection of the idea that that writing held power?
For sure. This issue of writing holding power, words hold power, very much so. Names hold power. In the so-called Babylonian epic of creation, one of the tests that Marduk has is to see if he can make a constellation disappear with his words, and he does so. He wishes it out of existence and wishes it back into existence. But writing is also extremely fundamental to this culture because, for example, Gilgamesh, Lugar Bandha's son, the whole Gilgamesh tradition is essentially about how to achieve immortality through writing, or one of the threads of it. And in fact, the Epic of Creation also ends saying, we've told this and written it down so that future generations will know. So writing is everywhere. When you do divination, you open up an animal, kill an animal, open it up, and read what's on the liver. And the liver is called the tablet of the gods. The heavens, the constellations, are called the writing of the heavens. So they do think of their world through writing, but it's also the oral part, the words and incantations, which is what happens with Anzu when he loses his wings. He loses his magical incantations.
Thank you. As an astronomer, I'd like to have that constellation trick.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. I think you were maybe next, yeah?
Does a similar revisionism inform the treatment of Huwawa, the demon, in the Gilgamesh story? Because I know there's some ambivalence about his role in the woods.
Yeah, so that actually is an excellent question and suggests to me that you've been reading your Gilgamesh, so very good. So the question about Huwawa is exactly analogous in some ways with the question of Anzu. Because Huwawa lives in the Cedar Mountains in Lebanon, and he's a happy monster in his jungle. And I think you probably are familiar with the recent text of Tablet 5 that made such a furore in social media over the last year, which really describes Huwawa in his environment. And it's clear that when Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill Huwawa, they are committing sacrilege. Enlil has put Huwawa there as the rightful guardian of the forest or the jungle. So yeah, this notion that, monsters are all bad is our notion. And in fact, these characters are more kind of liminal beings that are not quite gods, they're not quite humans, but they have their role, and the gods have assigned their role, and when we disrupt that role, we commit sacrilege. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Since Ur was supposed to be a cosmopolitan city with a lot of different peoples inhabiting it, I just wonder if Anzu appears in other cultures that we're inhabiting, or if Anzu traveled outside of the Sumerian area.
That's a very interesting question. Did Anzu travel? I'm going to be honest and say not that I know of. I do not have an exhaustive acquaintance with all of the iconography of Iran, for example, but I don't think anybody's ever pointed out that he was anything more than a very local monster. He traveled in the sense that, I mentioned there were 16 pieces of this. So he travels to Susa in Iran. There are 2 tablets from Susa of this story. And he travels to Turkey because we have another site in Turkey, Huzarina, where we have 2 tablets from there. And that version actually is slightly different. So the story travels with cuneiform culture, but I don't know if Anzu the creature travels. That's a very interesting question. Thank you. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention and for the questions.